Good evening and welcome to the Oklahoma City Museum of Art and our members' celebration and lecture for the museum's original exhibition, Paul Reed, a Retrospective. Our journey to this moment began a decade ago when we selected Reed's number 17, the first painting that you'll see in the exhibition, for the Saint Pompidou's Matisse in His Time exhibit that we hosted. We were the exclusive North American venue. That exhibition marked the beginning of our relationship with Jean Reed Roberts, the artist's daughter. Over the years, that connection deepened in extraordinary ways and culminated in this exhibition and our reason for celebrating tonight. All of this was made possible through Jean's incredibly generous gift of more than 125 works from her parents' trust and from her own private collection. There are many people to thank, but none more deserving of our gratitude than Jean, whose passion and tireless advocacy for her father's artistic legacy made this exhibition possible. We are also grateful to her children, Nathan, Amy, and Rebecca, and to the entire Roberts family for their support in so many meaningful ways. Thank you to the Roberts family. Our sincerest thanks also go to the exhibition's many sponsors, and I will name them now. The Ann Lacey Foundation, led by Chris Lawson. Or rather, the Lacey Foundation was the exhibition's catalog sponsor, and then the exhibition sponsors are as follows. Annie Bohannon, Larry and Ronna Davis, Jim and Jennifer Wineland, Lynn and Ernesto Sanchez, Sodi and Robert Clements, Jason Hammonds and Steve Cooter, Dean and Jeannie Jackson, Don and Carol Kasperite, Polly and Larry Nichols, Chip Oppenheim, Caroline and Guy Patton, Amalia Miranda, Bob and Cindy Barnard, Jacqueline and Tim Burney, Terry Cooper, Karen Delaney, the Kerr Foundation, the James Cray Mead family, and Eric Salazar and Christopher Lloyd. Thank you all. Finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce our curator and tonight's speaker, David Gariff, PhD. David is a senior lecturer at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and a scholar of modern art, film history, and the Italian Renaissance. He has taught at the Catholic University of America, the University of Wisconsin, Cleveland State University, Trinity Washington University, and the University of Maryland, College Park. It is truly a privilege to welcome David this evening to speak on a subject for which he is perhaps uniquely qualified, the art and enduring legacy of Paul Reed. Please join me in welcoming to the stage David Gariff.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for coming. If you were here for my first lecture, you'll recall that what I spoke about was specifically about Paul Reed and about the exhibition. So that was my, I guess you could say, my microscopic talk. And today is my macroscopic talk, because what I'm going to talk about today is the context of the Washington Color School from which Paul Reed emerged. And of course, you already know much of this story about how the paintings from the Washington Gallery of Modern Art ended up here in Oklahoma. And I don't need to go through that history again. It's been covered actually in another lecture. One of my colleagues and catalog contributors, Eric Keel. Here is one iteration of your part of the gallery that always is dedicated to these particular artists. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the Washington Color School, how they came into existence, what exactly were they, what did they think, how did they get formed, what is the philosophy, if you can say that, undergirding the group. And to do that, you have to confront certain, not necessarily, I guess you do, it is philosophical, because you have to confront the writings of these two individuals that you see on the screen. On the left is Clement Greenberg, and on the right is Harold Rosenberg. These were two of the most important New York critics in the 40s and into the 50s, and they knew each other, and they sort of competed with each other, and they had different theories and ideas about painting. And they actually had, while they were both champions of the abstract expressionists, they actually saw that movement in two different ways. So they weren't even in agreement about what that was. In the case of Greenberg, he felt that what was significant about New York School abstract expressionist painting were the things that he felt were most pertinent and unique to the art of painting. And when he was asked, well, what are these elements just unique to the art of painting? He cited two things: flatness and color. And so he is the pure, what you might call, formalist. Against that was Harold Rosenberg. And when he looked at abstract expressionism, he saw it differently. And he is actually the critic who coined the term action painters. Because when he saw abstract expressionism, what he was captivated by was the kinetic, theatrical kind of application of the paint, most especially in the work of Jackson Pollock. So he saw abstract expressionism as, he coined this phrase, as an arena in which to sort of paint. So they had these two different sort of strains. Now, in setting the stage again, there are one of the persons who's most important is seen here on the left with her husband at that time, and this is Helen Frankenthaler. So Helen Frankenthaler is important in this discussion because it was her early avenues of beginning to explore staining canvases, not brushing, but staining, that would become a hallmark of DC Color School. So here she is on the left with David Smith, and the painting she's actually in front of is the pivotal painting. It's today at the National Gallery in Washington. It's Mountains and Sea from 1957. And this is a stained painting that has some charcoal, but I'll come back to that in a second. The photograph on the right is Kenneth Noland with Helen Frankenthaler, with Clement Greenberg, the three of them, up in Connecticut in August of 1979. Now, it was actually Clement Greenberg, who introduced, this gets sort of like a soap opera. Greenberg first introduced Frankenthaler to David Smith in 1950, and they developed this incredible bond that lasted all the way up until David Smith's untimely death in a car crash. Frankenthaler had met Greenberg in 1950 and had, in fact, a 5-year relationship with him, in case you're keeping notes. And then later, she married Robert Motherwell. From 1950, they were married in 1958, they were divorced in 1971. So in 1954, Greenberg introduced Morris Lewis, one of the members of the color school, to Helen Frankenthaler. And in fact, it was Greenberg who had encouraged both Morris Lewis and Kenneth Noland to go to New York. Greenberg had family connections in D.C., so he was frequently in Washington, D.C., and he encouraged these two painters, Lewis and Noland, to go to New York to see what Helen Frankenthaler was doing. And so, in fact, they took his advice and they went to New York and they looked at what she was doing. And in fact, at that time, ironically enough, she was working on this painting that we have now at the gallery. This is Mountains and Sea from 1952. And Lewis and Noland made their visit to New York City in 1953. And here is Helen Frankenthaler in her New York studio, but this is a later photograph from the 60s. This is from 69, showing you how she would work. She would put the unstretched and unprimed canvas on the floor, and then she would take whatever, usually it could be anything, cups, bowls, a can, whatever she could sort of use to then basically pour out the paint. And then when she poured out the paint, then she would work that with very often a squeegee and work it around. So here she is again. And it was this particular technique of staining in which the color, because the canvas is unprimed, it's unprimed cotton duck canvas, when you apply paint to it, the paint just seeps right into the fabric. So you can't, it's no longer paint on a surface, it's paint in the surface. And you can't get flatter than that. So Greenberg was really excited about this. This is where we're going, flatness and color. Okay, so then he had to, it's so important during this period because many museums, what we're talking about in this period is who or what are going to be the successors to abstract expressionism. And this was a big heated debate in museums, curators, exhibitions, critics, because the idea was, you can only be avant-garde for so long, and then you're not avant-garde anymore. You're kind of old hat, So this is what was going on in the world of American art at this time. And so Clement Greenberg decided to put his money where his mouth was, shall we say. And so he curated an exhibition believe it or not in New York, but it was in Los Angeles, the LA County Museum of Art. And that's the catalog on the left, which is kind of strange because it's just a spiral bound catalog that then kind of unfolds when you open it. So from the cover, you don't really see the full title. But he titled this exhibition Post-Painterly Abstraction. Post-Painterly Abstraction. So the artists in this exhibition were still working in an abstract mode, but they were post-painterly. They were after de Kooning and Klein and Pollock, who were very painterly. So this was painting after being painterly. Now, on the right is interesting. This is a great photograph. It shows, this is Clement Greenberg's apartment in New York City. And he had been given a painting by Kenneth Noland, and it's the painting you see on the wall there. The title is a gift from 1961 to 62. And what's fascinating is where he placed this painting. He placed it right over his desk so that he looked at it every day and just became sort of hypnotized almost by this painting. Now, Greenberg's, his bet was on this post-painterly abstraction. The exhibition ran from April 23rd to June 7th, 1964, and then it did travel. It went to the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. It went to the Art Gallery of Toronto. But it was the essay that he wrote for this catalog where he sort of put forward his ideas and what he was sort of seeking. And so he talked about what was the so-called 10th Street touch. And by that he meant almost all of these abstract expressionist artists had worked around 9th and 10th Street. It was a kind of their neighborhood. And so he said that the 10th Street touch had descended into a set of mannerisms, according to which a dozen, then 1,000 artists proceeded to more or less the same ranges of color and with the same gestures. In other words, now we're talking about second generation that is simply parroting minus the originality of the first generation. So it's no longer the avant-garde. And of course, Greenberg went through his own relationships. He started by championing Jackson Pollock, but then he himself began to turn away from Pollock because of this idea of flatness, and then he turned instead to supporting Clifford Still, and in fact in Mark Rothko. And of course, this once, again, without getting too much into the soap opera, once Greenberg abandoned Pollock and took on Still, this was devastating to Jackson Pollock. And then that's when he began to drink very heavily, and his life began to sort of descend into the hell that it was in his last years. So the LA show featured the work of 31 painters, and most of the Washington painters were in that exhibition. Ironically, the painter that wasn't in that exhibition was Paul Reed. And this is always a kind of thing about Paul Reed. People know the color school, and they talk about it, and they wax poetic about these other 5 artists, and then you get this kind of, and Paul Reed kind of thing. And that's why this is the first major retrospective of the art of Paul Reed, which is roughly 30 years late, but nonetheless, this is the retrospective along with the catalog that will now become the touchstone for any future scholarly work on Paul Reed. Anybody working on him now will have to start here in Oklahoma and with this exhibition. So one of the reasons that Greenberg felt that the DC painters had a certain edge now, and he was championing them, he states when he's referring to both Lewis and Noland, and then he goes on to say, quote, who both live in Washington, D.C., which fact is not unrelated to the quality of their work. From Washington, you can keep in steady contact with New York, the New York art scene, without being subjected as constantly to its pressures to conform. And that is true. You can work in D.C., you can still hop the train, go to New York, or whatever, but if you're not living in New York, it can be an advantage because all of the critics and all of the sort of whirlwind of ideas and shows and criticisms can be a bit overwhelming. Today it's ironic because most Washington, D.C. artists today, their goal is to get to New York. So the reason the Washington, D.C. contemporary art scene is very different than New York, there are several reasons for this. One is the dominance in D.C. of museums, all of which are free except for the Phillips collection. And the weight of these museums and their history bears down on a contemporary artist today, on a young painter today. And so today, most of them, if they gain any kind of reputation in DC, as soon as they're sort of on the map, then they go to New York. So here's Noland on the left again with Greenberg, and then there's that painting I just mentioned. Today the painting is in the Tate Modern in London, and it's a typical Kenneth Noland. It's a stained canvas, and he sort of champions this kind of circular target sort of a motif. Paul Reed is in the same mode when he starts, but instead of these sort of target shapes, he has that mandala shape that you'll see when you're in the exhibition, the first few rooms. Now, I mentioned the fact that after the abstract expression, when Greenberg said, okay, those guys are done, and now we have to find something new, there was a big kind of effort on the part of especially museums, museum curators, and critics writing for journals like most especially the Art News. And it was to now find something to replace the abstract expressionists. Greenberg, he was okay. He found DC. Other curators were looking differently, and that led to a series of exhibitions. And these exhibitions were meant very much to put forward the view that this should be the new thing, whatever the exhibition was about. And 3 of the most important are here. The New Images of Man in the upper left, which was curated by Peter Seltz. Peter Seltz was actually most noted for his writings on German Expressionism, but at this time he was actually at MoMA, curator at MoMA. So he was advocating for a return to realism, a return to imagery, images of man. It was sexist, but images of people. So he felt we should go back to that. Then in the center was the exhibition. Also, these were all 3 at MoMA. The Images of Man was in 1959. And then within a couple of years, another curator at MoMA, William Seitz, curated an exhibition called The New Assemblage. And what he was advocating was, as the term says, assemblage, building things, taking materials from nature, whatever, constructing things. And that was a kind of counter to abstract expressionism, which could be a little maybe too theoretical. And if you're now looking at a sculpture that's made out of packing crates, it kind of puts you in reality. And then the third avenue that was put forward was also by William Seitz, believe it or not, but it was now in 1965 in the catalog here, and that was the responsive eye. And what he was putting forward was now the idea of optical painting, what we now call op art, art that has the imagery that actually affects the way your retinas sort of see painting. So these were all vying for dominance. My colleague, Eric Heel, who wrote one of the chapters in the catalog and wrote about the WGMA and how it kind of got started and what happened, it was a very intriguing story. And then its connections with Oklahoma, that's already been covered. But the founding of the Washington Gallery of Modern Art was in part because at that time, the district didn't have a real modern art museum. The one museum they did have, which in fact is America's oldest modern art museum, is the Phillips Collection, which had been founded by Duncan Phillips in 1921. But other than that, the Hirshhorn hadn't been built yet. So this was the idea that DC needed a modern and contemporary art museum. And a number of people were involved in this, and two of the most important were Alice Denny, here on the left, who became, essentially, she never became the director, but she was very powerful, and she was at one point the assistant director. She had come from Western Pennsylvania. She had studied actually medicine at Duke University, and then she changed into away from medicine, specifically into nutrition. She wrote a lot about nutrition, believe it or not. And she came to DC in 1950, and it was actually Alice Denny who formed this gallery called the Jefferson Place Gallery in 1958. Now, this was a cooperative. So each artist could pay, it's sort of like a labor union. You pay your dues, and then you could be part of this cooperative. You were guaranteed so many exhibitions, et cetera. And that's what she was working with. But she really was thinking almost too locally and not sort of nationally or internationally enough. And so the actual first director who came on board was the woman on the right, and this is Adeline Breeskin, who by this time had an incredible reputation as an art historian. She's a scholar on Mary Cassatt. She had been the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art. Now she retired from Baltimore and came to be the director of the museum in DC, this fledgling institution. And as it turned out, Denny and Breeskin hated each other. And so this began this long sort of political saga, and ultimately Breeskin stepped down. She was director from 62 to 64. Gerald Norland came in 64, and he was the curator who curated the Washington Color School exhibition. He was there only from 64 to 65. Charles Millard was there from 65 to 67. And then Walter Hopps was there from 67 to when the museum or the gallery closed in 68. This was the Jefferson Place Gallery. These are obviously older photographs. These foam pieces that are hanging there, it looks like somebody threw up. These were actually foam sculptures by the artist Ed Zern from 1972. So this became the hub of contemporary artistic activity in DC before the WGMA sort of opened up. And this was run by Alice Denny. She had founded this facility and this cooperative. And so she had assumed an important role in contemporary Washington art at the time. But it was with the opening of the WGMA that we begin to see now a focus on what we today think of as the Washington color painters or the DC color school. And of course, what was the most important moment was this exhibition. The catalog here is on the left, in which the then director, Gerald Nordland, curated the show, and he included 6 specific artists: Gene Davis, Thomas Downing, Morris Louis, Howard Mehring, Kenneth Noland, and Paul Reed. And this was the show that kind of put them on the on everybody's radar screen. And even more so because this exhibition traveled. It traveled to at least, I can't remember, 4 or 5 other locations in the United States. So it really did promote these artists out in the public. It went, it went to the University of Texas, the University of California, Brandeis University, and then it ended at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. Now, so that's the catalog. That's kind of like the holy grail about all of these artists. On the right, I'm showing you a much later publication, and I'm just showing you one volume. And this is a 3-volume work that was written by the French art historian Claudine Humblay, and it's 3 volumes. And volume 2 is devoted to the DC color painters, and in volume 2, she spends a lot of time on Paul Reed. And so this is one of the most important sources on Reed, is this particular 3-volume set. It was originally written in French, and then it was translated into English. So that introduced the color school people, and here's Morris Louis on the left, Kenneth Noland in the center, and Gene Davis on the right. Both Mehring and Lewis died young. They died in their 40s. Downing died in his 50s. Davis died in his 60s. Noland died in his 80s. And Paul Reed lived to be 96. And in this regard, there is something to be said for longevity. He outlived all of the members of this group. And it's interesting because still most people who know Paul Reed's work know this decade of the 60s, which is in the exhibition. But what this exhibition does is show you what Paul Reed was doing between 1960 and 2014. He died in 2015. So that's another reason why this exhibition is particularly important. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with these artists. Morris Louis in the upper left. This is Point of Tranquility from 1959 at the Hirshhorn. The painting in the center is in our exhibition. We borrowed this from the Toma Foundation. The one thing you don't have here in Oklahoma is a Kenneth Noland. So you need to get one. And sooner rather than later. So, in fact, I would really schmooze the Toma Foundation to see if they would just gift you this one, because it's magnificent. This is Burnt Day from 1962. And then the painting, of course, that you have in your permanent collection that came from the WGMA is the Gene Davis Cool Staccato. Now, looking at Morris Louis briefly, this is his wedding portrait in the upper left. He got married in Baltimore in 1947. And he lived in 2 different houses in Washington, D.C. They were married in 1947. They moved into a sort of a 2-room apartment in what is Silver Spring, Maryland, the suburb of D.C. And they converted the bedroom into his studio. But then they moved to the house that you see here. And when I go trick-or-treating, I always look through the windows of this house. I'm not sure people know that Morris Louis used to live there. So that's he moved to this location here in the Northwest, where he had a dining room that was 12 by 14 feet. And the reason, to a large extent, that Morris Louis's paintings are always 12 by 14 feet is because he always worked in the dining room. He didn't have a studio. And his wife was a school teacher. In the morning, she'd get up, she'd go out to school to work. He would start painting. He'd stretch out, he'd lay out the canvas on the floor. And of course, a lot of this is where he has to pick up the canvas to get the paint to sort of run. And he was like Mondrian in a certain way. He's like painted in a suit. And a suit and tie. He never dropped a piece and no paint. His wife would come home and she didn't go, "Oh my God, what'd you do with all the paint?" because it was immaculate. And he would finish by the time she got home, and then they would spend the evening together. So he had a particular kind of schedule. And it's interesting because Paul Reed, of course, ultimately is working in his house and is limited in scale. Initially, Paul has a big studio in D.C., which allows him to create paintings that, like the one we have in the exhibition, Hackensack, which is 14 feet high. But once he loses that studio, his work begins to take on a smaller scale. So this is Morris Louis, some of the smaller works. This is Submarine from 1948, which we have at the National Gallery. And then you have this painting that came from the WGMA. This is titled The Distance of Time from 1952. So one of the things that is important that I now have to mention relates to this process of staining. We've talked about Helen Frankenthaler, but there was a new paint that was invented at this time, and it was called Magna, and it was a resin. It was an acrylic paint, but it was resin-based, and so it behaved basically like a watercolor paint. It's different from what were modern acrylics because it was composed of pigment particles in this kind of resin, which had its own kind of emulsion. I know this is getting technical, but it made a paint that was very fluid, very easy to work with in many ways, and there would be no way you could really paint some of these pictures if you didn't have a very fluid kind of paint, and it was water soluble, so that was good. All of these things, and in fact, this paint was being experimented with by certainly Morris Louis, Barnett, Newman, and Roy Lichtenstein were using Magna as well. So this is where science moves art history forward. Very often, things that affect the history of art aren't really necessarily about art per se, but they're about some kind of scientific or other kind of idea. So when you see these paintings in Magna, and here's the one we have at the National Gallery, this is Beta Kappa from 1961. It's part of a series that Lewis titled the Unfurled series, which is basically from 1960 to 61. And here is where he would have the canvas on the floor in the dining room, and then he would start to run these dribbles, these paint. It would go into a gutter, but he would have to lift the canvas to get it to sort of move. And what's remarkable is how precise this is, even when you're kind of just letting things move by gravity. And then on the right is a painting that's in the exhibition. This is another painting that you need to acquire. This is from the Toma Foundation that loaned the Kenneth Noland, so you can get 2 for 1. And this is number 2-07 from 1961. That is in the exhibition. It's in the room. You know, the exhibition has 2 sections. There's the section about Paul Reed, and then we decided to have another section. And when we were working on it, we called it the Legacy Gallery, just so we knew what we were talking about. And it's all of the artists, or many of the artists, who were not technically necessarily part of this original group, but were influenced by them in some manner. You have to remember that all of these artists, in terms of the DC Color School, were professors, were teachers. And so they had the impact was incredible that they had on students, some of which are here tonight. And in the case of Paul Reed, the other thing that some sort of gets lost in the shuffle sometimes about, well, why wasn't he better known or this or that? He was married in 1939, and then he started having children, and he had a family to support. And so that's why he spent years as a graphic designer and illustrator, working for newspapers, magazines. He had to, put food on the table, and he comes to painting late, in part because he's trying to just earn a living. So here you see a close-up of Beta Kappa. This detail on the left. Morris Louis worked in series, of course, Paul Reed worked in series, and when we laid out the exhibition, we could have laid it out in many different ways, but the best way, I think, was to lay it out the simplest way, which was chronologically. So when you go through the exhibition, it makes sense that you see how he's sort of moving from series to series. These are your two Gene Davises, Autumn's Largo and Cool Staccato. This is the Howard Mehring on the left is the one that you own here, double black from 1964, and the one on the right is what we own at the National Gallery called Gemini. And these are, again, these are all stained on unprimed canvas. This is your Leon Berkowitz on the left, called Chasuble number 6 from 1965. And an artist who isn't maybe as well known as he should be. I actually curated a show in Maryland when he was still alive. It was one of the last shows he came to, and that's James Hillary here on the right. This is titled number 98, and this is another painting in the Toma Foundation. So I think you should have everybody from the Toma Foundation here for a big banquet. Of course, you have a gorgeous Sam Gilliam. This is Khufu here, relating to the name of an Egyptian pharaoh from 1965. And another beautiful, these are two from the 60s. I'm showing you paintings from that sort of important decade. And this is Blue Let, excuse me. That's in a gallery in Los Angeles on the right. I meant to say a little bit more about the fact that these artists were teachers and professors. And what you had in DC at this time was this almost kind of consortium of universities and art schools. Of course, you had the Corcoran, and the Corcoran is where Paul Reed taught, Howard Mehring taught at the Corcoran, Tom Downing taught at the Corcoran. You had the University of Maryland in College Park, Sam Gilliam taught at College Park, Ann Truitt taught at College Park. I actually got my PhD from Maryland, and I studied with both Sam Gilliam and Ann Truitt. You had Catholic University, where both Morris Lewis and Kenneth Noland taught. In the case of Alma Thomas, you had Shaw Junior High School, where she taught for 37 years. And so it was a tremendous kind of community of artists and writers and professors. This is Tom Downing, that's your collection, Blue Electric, 1962, and Shamrock on the right from 1964. And speaking of Alma Thomas, who was delightful, here she is. She died in 1978, but in the 70s, she was again still very active. And the painting on the right is called Alma's Flower Garden. She painted flowers a lot in this abstract way, especially pansies. She had her own garden that she would sort of look at and then abstract images from. This painting is actually, we borrowed from a private foundation. She was, Alma Thomas is very important for a number of reasons, but at the age of 80 in 1972, she was the first African-American woman to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum. She grew up in Columbus, Georgia, before settling in Washington, D.C. She was also one of the very first graduates from Howard University's, what at that time was a kind of fledgling art department. Elizabeth Catlett was another one who came out of Howard. She took night classes at American University, and then she became involved with abstraction, but she was, of course, a tremendous teacher, working with young, for the most part, she taught middle school. So she was working with young kids. And then about color, which is so important to all these artists, Thomas said, quote, "Through color, I have sought to concentrate on beauty and happiness rather than on man's inhumanity to man." So artists have different sort of purposes, and some really want to shock us and shake us up and make us think about the horror of the world. That was not Alma Thomas. This is Pansies in Washington on the left that we have at the gallery, and then Autumn Drama on the right. These are both from '69. Another artist, what we tried to do in the Legacy Gallery, up that part of the exhibition, was to bring forward artists who are not as well known. Maybe they sort of fell through the cracks, but especially in the realm of women artists and minority artists. And here was Kenneth Victor Young, and this is a painting we borrowed. You want to guess where we borrowed it from? Yeah, the Toma Foundation, The Fall of the Rebel Angels from 1970. And that shows him at work on the left, working on the floor, staining the canvas. Now, there are other artists as well who weren't necessarily at the core of the color school, but they were important nonetheless. Here's Hilda Shapiro Thorpe, who was from Baltimore. And she studied art at American University in the late 30s. She graduated in 59 and was awarded a grant along with Alma Thomas at that time that allowed her to sort of devote a lot of attention to her art. She was present at the Jefferson Place Gallery. There were a number of women who were exhibited at the Jefferson Place Gallery. Her first show there was in 1959. And she would remain connected to that institute, to that facility until the end of her life. She died in the year 2000. So all the way through, she was concerned with the Jefferson Place Gallery, then the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. And then she did also become a teacher. She taught at American University and at the Corcoran. Here are two more works. These are not, well, the one on the right is in the exhibition. The one on the left is not in the exhibition. So Red Shelf on the left from 1960, which is in a private collection. And then we did borrow this painting on the right from her estate, and that's titled Dividing Band from 1967. These are artists, some of whom were staining, some of whom were not, but they were all attracted to color and to paintings that had a certain dynamism, and so they all were kind of in a family, you might say. Mary Pinchot-Meyer is another artist who had a relatively tragic life, but here's a work that we originally were going to put in the exhibition, but it would have had to be conserved, and that became a problem. It's in a private collection, and because there are not many of her works anywhere, very few works. The one on the right is the most important, and that is at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It's called Half-Light from '64. And here in these tondos, these round pictures, and there's a sense of centrality again, you have this idea of bringing together both the color and the form. So the form is the color, and the color is the form. It's sort of meant to be unified. There are no lines, there are only sort of edges, and it's one color stops and the next color begins. And this is not revolutionary to the 20th century, certainly. When we go through the history of art and we put certain artists against each other, for example, we put Michelangelo against Titian as painters. Michelangelo is all about line and contours. Titian is all about color. So in Titian, a form just moves from a color to another color. In Michelangelo, there's a real specific sort of linear element. The same with Rubens versus Poussin. And then later in the 19th century, Jacques-Louis David against Delacroix. You have a similar thing. The idea that the great colorists like Delacroix were interested in was not so much drawing, but the idea of how colors make edges naturally through their sort of superimposition on other colors. In the Renaissance, this was the great debate between what was called disegno and colore. Disegno meant drawing, and colore meant color. Again, here's Helen Kinsey Hersbrun. This is one of the invitations to an exhibition at the Jefferson Place Gallery. She was born in Chicago. She started off actually as an English major, and she studied at the Art Institute of Chicago. She moved to DC in 1949. She worked with another really important teacher painter in DC at that time, and that's Jack Twerkoff, who was at American University at that time. She was a very important part of what was going on at Jefferson Place, and also in general, just trying to, I mean, I'm sure it's not a surprise to you that women had a tough time. And they had a tough time, especially you're trying to break into this group of men. I mean, it was really horrible in abstract expressionism because these guys were like super macho, drinking, breaking beer bottles on their heads and things like that. So Elaine de Kooning and Lee Krasner, and they were married to these artists. It was still very, 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 very tough. And there was, in 1963, Helena had a show at the Jefferson Place Gallery, and the Washington Post reviewed it and said, quote, the categorical honesty of her statement is characteristic of the artist as a painter and as a person. The vital painterly approach she has used has been a signature form from the beginning, unchanged and uninfluenced by the new little isms that sweep the art world each season. The strong slashing brushwork strokes are laid on with a strength and vigor that admits to no compromise. There are no blurred or uncertain corners in her work. And so we do have one of her works in the exhibition. It's the one on the right, which actually is owned by American University. The painting on the left is in a private collection. The one on the left is untitled from 1955. And on the right, it's Aeroplot from 1970. We come to an artist that, of course, was very important, even if she were, again, a slightly younger contemporary, and that's Anne Truitt, somebody that I had the honor and the pleasure to study with, even though I was not studying sculpture, I was studying art history. So here is Anne Truitt. On the left, a photograph in her first studio. It was a large studio she had near DuPont Circle from about 1962. Then that studio, just like with Paul Reed, she had to give up that studio, the prices, the rent, and sometimes the studios were they were becoming flop houses and things. And then she took a studio that was in fact behind her house in Cleveland Park in 1979. She's from Baltimore. An incredible woman. She studied psychology at Bryn Mawr. She graduated in 1943. She worked at the Massachusetts General Hospital as an assistant in the psychiatric lab and as a nurse's aide. She left psychology in the mid-40s, first to write fiction. She actually was more interested initially in being a writer. And then she enrolled just kind of serendipitously for some courses at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Washington. And then she had her epiphany. Sometimes artists have these epiphanies. So it's like, Saul on the road to Damascus, they fall off their horse. And for her, it was when she first saw the paintings of Barnett, Newman, and Ad Reinhardt, which were these monochromatic but beautifully realized surfaces. And then that's when she sort of decided that she would pursue a career in art. Her sculptures, which you see here on the right, have always been linked, as you might expect, to minimalism, to these sort of static, perfectly formed, isolated shapes. It looks like there's not much going on here, but when you really look, and you're fortunate, you have an Anne Truitt that's actually in the exhibition. The surfaces are really quite remarkable. And then the thing that runs counter, when people would say she was a minimalist, she would counter by saying, no, first of all, her works were not untitled or number 6. She gave them titles. And the titles were very evocative usually and had you thinking about things. The other part of Anne Truitt's career that's so important, and again, I hope some of you are aware of this, is she kept journals through her life. And 4 of them were published. And the first one is called Daybook, the Journal of an Artist from 1982. Then she followed that with Turn, the Journal of an Artist from 1986. And then she followed that with Prospect, the Journal of an Artist from 1996. And then her last journal was published posthumously, titled Yield, the Journal of an Artist, published in 2022. I always recommend these books to any of my students, women students, female students, who want to understand what it meant to be an artist then, the particular obstacles, prejudices, things that one might have to encounter. But beyond that, her writing is beautiful. It doesn't matter if you're interested in art or not. Her journals are really quite beautiful. They're very personal. She wrote poetry. She was really a very remarkable woman. We did an exhibition of her art at the National Gallery. That's on the left. At the National Gallery, we have these, what we call tower galleries, sort of at the top of the East Building. So we devoted one exhibition to her back in it started in 2017 and ran through 2018. And then this is the work you own here on the right, which is called The Sea. So you begin to see the sense of the blue in the sea. And I mean, they work in a very interesting fashion. She is really not very. She never really warmed up, shall we say, to artists like Donald Truett or Carl Andre, and she worked quietly, to a large extent, independently. Kept her own counsel, but produced really a remarkable body of work. At one point, I have a quote here where she said, "In my studio, I feel at home with myself, peaceful at heart, remote from the world, totally immersed in a process so absorbing as to be its own reward." Now, what's interesting about that is that is very much, that could have been said by Paul Reed. And when there are discussions about why wasn't Paul Reed better known or this or that, one of the reasons is because Paul Reed was not a businessman. He was not a money man. He didn't do the things that artists have to do, most especially today, and that is to cultivate the right galleries, to cultivate the right critics, to be out and about, to be social, to be at every opening of every artist who ever lived in your city, to be a very dynamic kind of social butterfly. The artist who was like that is the artist that was Reed's childhood friend, Gene Davis. Gene Davis was like, I don't even know how to. He was a whirligig, and he spent as much time outside of his studio as he did inside of his studio. And he was a tremendous performer, and he sponsored, costume parties and everything. He was such a force in D.C. that everybody knew Gene Davis. But Paul wasn't of that ilk. He was just not. And this was a source of friction. They were childhood friends, and as their careers advanced, this was a source of frustration from Paul Reed. I say this because I met Paul Reed in 2010, so I know what I'm talking about because these were conversations that we had. He was a friend of 15 years, and we would talk about that, and he really couldn't. Why does everybody like Gene Davis? And what did I do? Where did I go wrong? And then you'd tell him, well, Paul, you kind of never left the house. And then he would say, oh, well, yeah, maybe you're right. But it was still a kind of a prickly topic for him. Now, I mentioned Clement Greenberg, and I mentioned in passing Harold Rosenberg, and here they are again. And here is encapsulated in each of these quotes the two successive movements that each one would champion and what they thought was the logical successor to abstract expressionism. Harold Rosenberg writes, "At a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act. rather than as a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express an object, actual or imagined. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event. So for him, what was important about abstract expressionism was this kinetic activity and also this relationship essentially to life and to being in things and of things. Now, Greenberg, in contrary to Rosenberg, said, quote, "The task of self-criticism in modern art became to eliminate from the specific effects of each art any and every effect that might conceivably be borrowed from or by the medium of any other art. Thus, would each art be rendered pure, and in its purity find the guarantee of its standard of quality as well as of its independence." So, purity, what is it that is inherent only to the art of painting? What makes painting painting? And how and why should that be important and not be sort of sullied by other things? And for him, it was, as I've already mentioned, flatness and color. And so he had his artists in the DC Color School. So that leads us to things like this. This is Jasper Johns' Target with plaster casts from 1955. So remember, Johns and Rauschenberg are working in the 50s. And the Target series, which created an incredible stir by Johns, this is from 55. And I've just brought back Kenneth Noland, because you could say, well, they're both like targets and things like that. Well, Harold Rosenberg and Greenberg would totally disagree. The Nolan is pure. It's pure painting. It's flatness, it's color, it's abstract. There's nothing else touching it. Of course, for Rosenberg, Jasper Johns is what art is about. And in fact, not only doesn't have purity, even though the shape of a target has a certain abstract sort of convenience or history, but you're supposed to go up to that painting and close all the little doors and open them up again and interact with the painting like it's a happening. So you're supposed to go up and flip all these things down. They have a lot of personal things going on here, including anatomy of the artist, various parts. It's a whole different world. And so when you get the split in modernism at this time, really these two guys kind of are the highway markers, because ultimately Rosenberg will take you towards happenings, performance art, and most especially pop art. That's Rosenberg, because that's where this is going to end up. Of course, for Clement Greenberg, pop art gave him a heart attack. What do you mean? It's a Campbell soup can. It's from a cartoon of Mickey Mouse. And that's where Greenberg wrote his famous essay about kitsch, that wasn't art, it was kitsch. And so that's the two sort of tracks that will then unfold. And here again, if you put Rauschenberg against Morris Louis, these guys are on different planets. Louis is again concerned with pure painting, surface, flatness, color, all of those things. And Rauschenberg, in his great combine called Canyon from 1959, these are contemporary. 1958 for Morris Louis, 1959 for Rauschenberg. We've got an eagle, we've got a pillow, we've got all kinds of collage elements in the Rauschenberg. And what Rauschenberg said and why his combine, what he meant by the word combine, so what am I combining? What he said was that the world that he works in, what he said was, I work in the gap between art and life. So for him, art was made of the real world. And that meant everything. You're walking down the street, you find a styrofoam cup, pick it up. You might need it later. And you trip over a box. Yeah, okay, let's take that. You go through a dumpster and there's a great tire in there. Oh, I can definitely use that. And this is as far from purity on all levels as far as you can get. So just to conclude, I'm showing you these group photographs, some of which are very famous. The photograph on the left is the famous photograph that appeared in Life magazine that was celebrating the importance of the abstract expressionists, and it's the whole group of the abstract expressionists together. And I'm juxtaposing it to another photograph that shows this different stable of artists who all were showing now with Leo Castelli. And so on the right, you have Ellsworth Kelly and Dan Flavin, Richard Serra, Jasper Johns, Klaus Oldenburg. They're all there. In that, you have Rauschenberg present there, and this was actually to celebrate Leo Castelli's. It was the 5th anniversary of the opening of his gallery. So that photograph was 1982. The earlier photograph from the 50s on the left is the famous. It was titled in Life magazine "The Irascibles," because these were all the artists that everybody they wouldn't cut you any slack if you said something. And so you have Jackson Pollock, you have Mark Rothko, who always looks like he hates the world. You have Robert Motherwell. You have everybody. The only woman who's at the very top of this group, and you have again. This is Robert Motherwell here. This is Willem de Kooning. This is Rothko. This is Pollock. That's Barnett Newman. So up here you have this one woman, and that's Hedda Stern. And Hedda Stern was a very gifted painter. She wasn't really so much an abstract expressionist, but she was kind of part of the group. She was a good sport, and she was part of the group. And the reason she's at the top here is because she found out very late that there was going to be this photograph taken. And she was the last person to arrive. And so they said, Hedda, go to the back and stand on these boxes so that we can see you. And so that's why it was her relegation to the top. So here we have the old guard of Rosenberg and Greenberg, for that matter, because they all championed abstract expressionism. And then this new track for Harold Rosenberg, taking you towards pop art happenings and all of that. Now, if we do this, we have the same group photograph of the abstract expressionists on the left. The one I just mentioned, that was in Life magazine in 1951. And if you go through the names of people there, it's Jimmy Ernst, Barnett Newman, James Brooks, Mark Rothko, Richard Poussadart, William Batsiotis, Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still, Robert Motherwell, Willem de Kooning, Ad Reinhardt. They're all there, okay? The gang is all there. But if you were following Greenberg's trajectory, these guys would be the successors. And these are the DC Color School artists. So it wouldn't have been that previous photograph of the so-called pop artists, or the artists who were more about life and art. It's these artists who are concerned with purity. So here we have Gilliam, and we have Sam Gilliam at the top, Mehring, Reed, Thomas, Davis, Nolan, Lewis, and Downing. So this is this trail, this fork in the road, is actually a very important one for understanding American art in the 20th century. And Paul Reed plays a very important place. He has a very important place in this, both within the context of the Washington Color School. And so during the 60s, he's right up with these other artists. There's nothing to talk about that sort of relegates him to he's not sitting on the bench. He's out there playing. But what becomes even maybe more important about Reed, and as I said, you can't really sort of predict who's going to live long and who's going to die young. But because Reed lived to be 96 and didn't repeat himself, when he worked through a series, eventually he would, it's time. He'd sort of limit his time on that particular, whether it's the disc paintings or the mandala painting, there's a series. And then he would move to something else, and he would push himself. He was aggressive. He was curious. He was incredibly intelligent. And so this retrospective, as I've said, is really long overdue. And he plays this very important role And because he lived so long and didn't repeat himself, he is particularly important. For example, Gene Davis. I mean, I hate to rag on Gene Davis. He was a very nice guy, but he's dead. And there are people here who could vouch for me on this. Okay, he's the stripe guy. I got it. He does stripes, and he's magnificent, at stripes. Okay, eventually, maybe we've done enough stripes. Maybe I should do something else. Maybe instead of doing them vertically, maybe I should do them horizontally, or do something. And he really didn't. And that is in part because he was so popular. His art was so popular. It would have taken a very strong personality to say, okay, yeah, I know everybody loves this, and as fast as I paint them, they're being sold. But that's not what my art is really about. It's about other things. And I don't think Gene, who lived to be 65, I don't think he really pushed himself in the way that Paul Reed did. That's my point. That's my only point. Gene Davis is still a great artist, but different. And with that, I will close. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that might come.
We have time for a few questions, please, from the audience. When you learned about the Oklahoma City Museum of Art's collection with the WGMA, that it ended up here, once you spent time with it, what were a few surprises for you?
When I spent time with it here in Oklahoma?
Yeah.
Well, it was just how incredibly important it was, and how every important artist and every work it's not somebody on a bad day. It was really, they're all at the top of their game. I mean, what you have here is an incredibly important repository of modern art and a number of important artists, and it's a tremendous gift. I mean, it's a gift to be cherished and taken care of and promoted. I hope people will come to see this exhibition who maybe don't come necessarily to Oklahoma City. I mean, I don't know the demographics of how things work, but it's kind of mind-blowing. And in another sense, it's mind-blowing. Now, when that happened, I was about 9 years old. But if I had been an adult and an art historian, I would have fought like hell to keep those paintings in D.C. I would not have wanted them to go anywhere. Not that I have anything against Oklahoma. I would not have wanted them to go to Toronto or San Francisco or Austin. I would have fought like hell. But things intervene, money, finances, politics, all of that. So again, you have a real gift here. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm afraid of your question.
Is there a uniqueness amongst the women, and what would that be?
Yeah. If you're asking me, is there a through line in terms of what they produced, the kind of work? Yeah, I don't believe there is. Each of these women, and there were had to fight their own battle. And they were, in a sense, in essentially a male-dominated environment, even when many of these women were also professors and teachers, and you had an all-male faculty. So I can't, what connects Anne Truitt to, another woman artist of the time, I can't see anything. There could be something there. I'd have to think about it, but I don't really. Do you think that's the case? This is one of the artists, by the way, in the exhibition. It's kind of befuddling, actually. Yeah.
I'll share one story that I experienced on a school tour. And Anne Truitt's The Sea was in an exhibition, a gallery rather, that was otherwise non-representational or non-objective. And I had just taken these students, this is maybe 15 years ago, from a gallery, 10 years ago, from a gallery that was focused on seascapes, maritime images, And I brought them immediately upstairs, and we sat in a circle in the round around the sea, didn't tell them a thing about it. And they all said, we're underwater.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting and cogent. And I think these works, and I've already talked to everybody here in terms of the docents, et cetera. Children love this art, in general. And they love to sit in front of it in a circle, and look at just the colors and the shapes and the geometry, and then to sort of feel free. They're totally uninhibited. They're not coming with some kind of agenda. And so it's just working optically and then kind of emotionally. The things children say about these paintings when when you're working with them, it's really quite remarkable. That's a perfect example. Yeah.
Please.
Again, that's a really good question.
David, will you repeat the question?
That Paul Reed worked with essentially a lot of transparency, that the layers were sort of transparent and you could sort of see the other colors schemes. The reason I chose the image on the catalog cover, which is number 181, which is in the exhibition, is that's when you get close to that, because at a distance it looks like, oh, maybe that's really tight and kind of hard edge and everything. But when you get close to it, and for me that image was the perfect image to encapsulate everything, because it had the staining, it had the unprimed canvas. You could see the corners were unprimed, right? It was cotton duck. You could see in that case when he was using a roller, about a 3-inch roller, and as he would lay those colors down, the difficult part of that is to keep everything wet at the same time. Work wet on wet. That's really hard to gauge. And of course, as you all know, if you just think about painting in watercolors, it looks pretty bright when you put it on, but then it dries lighter always. So I thought that painting just said it all. His abstraction, the angularity, the dynamism, the transparency, and all of that. So he was much more concerned with that than, for example, Gene Davis or Thomas Downing or Mehring. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I hope you enjoy the exhibition. I hope you tell your friends about it. It's going to be up until April, and I hope it gets a huge crowd. I'll be here Saturday just to count heads. And I'm not going to be out front with a signboard or anything.
Yes, you will.
Yeah, actually, I get a lot of instructions from everybody here about where I'm supposed to be. It does travel. It travels to the Torgler Center, which is on the campus of Christopher Newport University in Newport News. They have this magnificent new gallery. It's these huge glass sort of globes. And then from there, it goes to the Katzen Center in Washington, D.C., which is Paul's hometown. And where he's obviously what he's most associated with, and what I've arranged with other museums in D.C. is that when the exhibition comes to the Katzen Center, that all the other museums put out their Paul Reeds. So there could be like a pilgrimage trail, and you could go around to the Krieger and to the Hirshhorn and to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and see what they have. So hopefully it'll all come together. But this exhibition, it sounds weird because obviously I'm prejudiced. I just think it's beautiful. And I think everybody here, the staff here, the installation, everybody, it was all hands on deck. Everybody in this museum had something to do with that exhibition. And it's a gem, and it can stand up to anything, anywhere. So don't take it for granted.
And from all of us, from the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, our visitors near and far, we thank you, David Gariff.
Thank you.